Hello everyone, hopefully everyone can hear me, and just to let you know that we are recording this meeting, this webinar. So we're a few minutes early, but I think we've got most people here. So I'll just start and introduce Cathy, our speaker today. So Cathy is a senior lecturer in conservation of cultural heritage. Within the School of Heritage and History in the University of Lincoln, and has a background in archaeology and museum objects conservation. She first became interested in the impacts of climate change on heritage in 2007 while undertaking her MA in World Heritage, and has been researching it since then, including for her PhD in 2013. In 2019, Cathy was lead author and researcher for the Irish government's sectoral adaptation plan for built and archaeological heritage, which are part of Ireland's climate change NAP, the National Adaptation Plan. She is a bureau member of the International Climate Action Working Group of ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and Sites, and represents the University of Lincoln on the Climate Heritage Network, of which the University of Lincoln is a founding member. So Cathy, I'll let you take over.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Pip, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming today and giving up some of your lunch hour for this webinar, which is hosted by our colleagues in Lincoln Conservation. So today I'm going to talk to you about climate change risk assessment, and specifically for heritage sites and properties. I'm going to give you a short introduction to the topic, then talk about the basics around what is climate change risk assessment, approaches for heritage, how we can apply it to the heritage context, thinking about case study applications, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers. If there's anything as I go along that's not clear, also feel free to put up your hand if you have. I'm not sure if you have the ability to raise your hand, and I'll stop and try and clarify that for you. So the first thing is why, I suppose, I'm talking about this. As Pip said, I started to be interested and to do research on the topic of climate change and cultural heritage when I was doing my master's and then my PhD, which I did back in 2013. And for that, I did a vulnerability assessment, as it was called then, of the 2 World Heritage sites in Ireland to climate change impacts. So I was really interested in how we can understand what the impacts of climate change would be for cultural heritage. And at the same time then I started to become interested in also how we can monitor those impacts going forward. And climate change is a long-term issue. So obviously we have climate variability, the weather. But if you're talking about climate change, you need at least 30 years of data. So that raises some issues around monitoring. And I did some work on indicators for climate change impacts. And then obviously the next question is how you respond. So my research has also over the years gone into adaptation planning and policy. So the response, the adaptation response to those impacts. But the whole thing is a cycle. So when you respond, you then have to reassess your risk to see if that response is working. So at the basis of the whole thing really is understanding climate risk. And I think a lot more people are becoming interested in doing that, which is why I thought this was a good topic for the webinar. But having said that, if there's anything else that you'd like to ask me about, you can feel free to do so in the Q&A afterwards. So when you're talking about climate change, you need to engage with climate change science and policy. Now, not saying you need to become climate scientists, but we need to speak the language. And the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is the standard setter for all things to do with climate change. So when it comes to understanding what climate change risk is, they created this infographic, and this is the approach that will be taken across all sectors when assessing climate change risk. So I think it's a good idea to try to align whatever you're doing with the IPCC approach, because you can then talk to other people, and this whole climate change is a multi-sectoral and multidisciplinary topic. So what does the IPCC then define climate change risk as? So I'll read the definition, and you can see I've highlighted the key terms that I'll be coming back to throughout the presentation. So they say that in the context of climate change impacts, risks result from dynamic interactions between climate-related hazards with the exposure and vulnerability of the affected human or ecological system to those hazards. Hazards, exposure, and vulnerability may each be subject to uncertainty in terms of their magnitude and likelihood of occurrence, and each may change over time and space due to socioeconomic changes and human decision making. And that last bit is adaptive capacity. That's how the human changes and the changes in the system can reduce exposure or reduce vulnerability. Okay, so in this context, we can think about vulnerability as being a combination of sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and I'll come back to that. So that was a general approach to risk, which holds no matter what sector you're in. So if you're working in transport or health or agriculture, you would still look at those key elements. In the cultural heritage context, then, we can focus in a bit more. So in the cultural heritage context, climate change risk assessment involves assessing potential hazards and related impacts for heritage values and their attributes, assessing exposure of defined heritage values and their attributes, assessing sensitivity and adaptive capacity of the system, i.e., the vulnerability of defined values and attributes. So you can see there we're taking a values-based approach. So before you can start your risk assessment, you have to understand what are the values that you're trying to protect, what attributes or features hold those values. And I'm talking here really about tangible cultural heritage, but this same approach could apply to some extent to intangible heritage. The values and attributes will obviously change. So there's uncertainty around climate change because how bad it gets depends on how we react to mitigate greenhouse gases. So I don't want to leave that out of the equation. The best thing we can do for our heritage is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce climate change. What we do know, what we're already experiencing in the UK is warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers. This summer is not a great example, but that's the point, is that climate change happens over a long period of time. So one wet summer does not mean that it's not happening. We're looking at a longer term pattern. An increase in the frequency of extreme and unpredictable weather, which I think we can recognize. And of course, sea level rise, which for an island nation is very significant. So if we come back to that first term, which is hazards, and then the related impacts, I don't want to get too hung up on terminology, but just to say, if you are going to engage with this, there's a new publication which came out of work done by UCL for Historic England, where they looked specifically at hazards that are climate change hazards, which are relevant for cultural heritage. So there is a difference between hazards and impacts. So hazards are the climatic events, so say very heavy rainfall or a change in relative humidity, and the impact would be what that means for the heritage assets. So in the case of changing relative humidity, you could have changing salt weathering for stone. Yeah, so they're linked, and sometimes they can be a bit conflated, but just to be aware that there is the difference there, and that's a good publication if you want to start thinking about what the hazards might be. So in terms of impacts, hazards and impacts for climate change, then we can divide these into direct and indirect and further divide them. So the direct impacts are the impacts of that hazard directly on the cultural heritage, and these can be catastrophic, such as, for example, very heavy rainfall or a storm causing physical damage, causing flooding. or cumulative slow onset. So that could be, for example, changing relative humidity, which causes a change in salt weathering, or mold growth. And that takes place over a longer period of time, can be more widespread, can be less, catastrophic in terms of the damage, but can be harder also to track, not so visible. And then there's the indirect effects, and that's about how humans react to climate change. So a lot of efforts to mitigate greenhouse gases by reducing energy emissions. That's very important. But if retrofitting of historic buildings is not done in a sensitive way, it can cause a lot of damage. And same, for example, with flood relief defences or coastal defences. So in those cases where those have unintended negative consequences for heritage, we would consider that maladaptation. So that's a term that the IPCC use as well. And it's a trap that we all want to avoid when we are planning adaptation. So if you've thought about this, maybe there are already hazards that are of particular concern for you, or impacts that you're already seeing, or impacts that you're worried about. So I always think it's interesting to hear from you what you're most concerned about. So please feel free to pop in the chat. Maybe there's a reason that you came today because there's something you're specifically worried about, and we can maybe talk about it at the end. So now we're going to do a case study, and you might have thought we were going to do a heritage case study, but it's intangible heritage. It's the fairy tale of the Three Little Pigs, and if you're not familiar with it, the Three Little Pigs had an enemy who was the big bad wolf who wanted to eat them up, and he threatened to huff and puff and blow their houses down. So that's what we're going to talk about. Just as a way of kind of going through those steps of assessing exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and maybe have a bit of fun because it is lunchtime after all. Well, it may not be lunchtime wherever you are, but either way, we'll try and keep it a little bit light. So if we think about exposure then, we've talked about hazards, we think and impacts. So now we think about the exposure to those hazards and impacts. So exposure of cultural heritage is the degree to which an identified heritage value and the feature that carries that heritage value, depending on what those are, is exposed to climatic hazards and their related impacts. And that will be determined by environmental conditions, both physical, so where exactly it is, what direction it's facing, the topography of the landscape around it, and also atmospheric conditions, so the climate change projections for that area. And when you're assessing exposure, you have to think about the likelihood of your asset being exposed and the magnitude of its exposure, or the extent of its exposure. So is it only exposed on one side, or is it the whole asset? Is it, and what's the likelihood? And you can get likelihood from climate change projections. How much is the rain going to increase? How frequent will the floods or the droughts be? These are the kinds of data that you need to gather, and you need to understand your site to do that. So for the Three Little Pigs, the hazard, as I said, is the big bad wolf who's going to huff and puff. We could think about him as an extreme wind or storm. And the Three Little Pigs, if you don't know, they built three different types of houses. So one pig has a house of straw, one of sticks, and one of brick. And we can assess that all these houses are located in the same place. They all have the same orientation. So they are all exposed equally to the hazard of the huffing and puffing wolf, okay? But the brick house has some trees around it, and those trees provide some protection. So the brick house has a slightly lower exposure, okay? So that's how you can assess exposure. Now you might say, now are those trees evergreen trees? Will they lose their leaves in the winter and therefore exposure of the brick house will increase at certain times of the year? Or, do they actually add an additional layer of hazard because if they're shallow rooted trees and the wolf huffs and puffs, maybe they'll get blown over and now the brick house will be hit by a falling tree. That's what we call a compound hazard in climate change. So the impacts can layer on top of each other. So it can get quite complex. And this is something that you would discuss with a group of stakeholders. You would never be doing this kind of assessment by yourself, but you really do need to understand the site and the values. To help you gather information, there's a lot that's out there. If you're in the UK, I've put a number of links up there that you can take a screenshot of and go and investigate, that will tell you what the climate change hazards are for your location. So essentially what's your exposure over time given climate change projections. So a lot of this work has been done already, not necessarily for heritage. In some places it's been done for heritage. So the National Trust, for example, has done quite a lot of work on risk mapping, but it's also been done by local authorities, councils, by national and even international governmental organizations. So the World Bank does quite a lot of this kind of risk hazard mapping. So have a look for what you can find online, and you can probably find quite a lot of information that will help you assess your exposure to climate hazards. Sensitivity then is defined by the IPCC as the degree to which a system or species is affected either adversely or beneficially by climate variability or change. And as I mentioned before, this effect can be direct or indirect. For cultural heritage, then, we need to think about where the effect will occur. What are you interested in? So it could occur at an individual artifact level, assemblage, or even the wider system. And sensitivity will be related to factors such as form, function, composition, condition, etc. So it requires for you to really know your heritage property or collection or whatever it is. And part of that is understanding past interactions with the climate, because that can help our understanding of how sensitive it will be to future climate change. So again, when you're considering assessing sensitivity, you need to think about the likelihood. That can be the inherent susceptibility of the heritage asset and the magnitude of the effect. So the degree of loss of value or significance. So that likelihood and magnitude, which was in the IPCC definition, when we're thinking about it in terms of cultural heritage, we think about those kinds of things. So to illustrate that then, we go back to the three little pigs and we think again about sensitivity. Now here you can see exposure was quite similar, but sensitivity is very different because you have very different materials, very different forms and of the houses, different condition, right? So the brick house has deep foundations, and so it's made of of bricks and concrete, so it's stronger. The material is more resistant to the wind, and it has a very sharply pitched roof. So we're saying that that has a low sensitivity to the huffing and puffing, okay? Because of its materials, its form, etc. The stick house has a medium sensitivity. It's not as strong as the brick house. The roof is more likely, because of the nature of the way the roof is built, to be lifted by the wind. But it's still quite a stable, strong structure. But the straw house, because of the materials, very light, because of the structure, no foundations, it's very highly sensitive. So the likelihood of that being affected because of the nature of the house and the extent of the effect, you know, for the stick house, maybe some of the roof tiles would be lifted, but for the straw house, potentially the whole house could be lifted and moved away and destroyed. So the extent of the loss would be great. So very high sensitivity for the straw. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some idea of how you could apply it to a heritage situation. And then finally, we need to think that, that this is not happening in a vacuum. So what is the capacity to be resilient or to adapt? The IPCC defines adaptive capacity as the ability of systems, institutions, humans, and other organisms to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities, or to respond to the consequences. So there could be advantages here. And you need to look for opportunities where they exist. Adaptive capacity and cultural heritage then mostly lies, particularly with tangible cultural heritage, with monuments and sites. They don't have much inherent adaptive capacity. Intangible heritage, there's more capacity to adapt, to change, but for tangible heritage, it's more about the management, the ability of the management to reduce sensitivity or exposure to those climate change impacts. And this involves consideration of all possible actions and management responses, whatever those might be. So when we're thinking about adaptive capacity and we're trying to understand what is the adaptive capacity of this site or this heritage resource, we can think about policies and programs that might be relevant to the site and its values and its ability to respond. We can think about information and knowledge. What do we understand? What are the data gaps? What do we, what's missing? And also think about what I said about understanding past climate impacts. So think about institutional memory, the ability to go back in time and learn from what happened in the past, and the sharing of knowledge. Implementation, so what's being done already that could help? There may already be systems in place that can help to reduce sensitivity, such as maintenance programs, for example. And monitoring and feedback, that's important both for fully understanding and recording the impacts of climate changes, and also for measuring the effectiveness of the actions taken. And it's also important to consider the capacity of a site at the different scales that can affect it. So think about the local, but also think about the individual and the regional and national and institutional level. So there might be policies at national level that could help you at a local site level to leverage some resources or some training or something like that. Yes, so you have to, with climate change, it's interdisciplinary, it's multi-scalar, it's coming out and seeing the big picture as well. So if we go back to the three little pigs then and adaptive capacity, well, they've decided to build a big wall. So they're going to build a big wall all around their houses, and the wolf can't get in. And they've effectively adapted so that their houses are now not exposed. They haven't changed the sensitivity, but their exposure is reduced because they've built that big tall wall. So we can say that they all have the same adaptive capacity. They have the resources to build the wall, they have the knowledge and skills to build the wall, and they've obviously been able to get planning permission, so that's fine. Now, there can be some downsides to this. Obviously, for example, they've lost their view, whatever view they had. Maybe they've lost their easy access to the forest where they get their food. So there's a trade-off often between adaptive actions and their effects. And with cultural heritage, there's often that balance between how much you adapt before you start to have an impact on your heritage values and your significance. And that is context specific, and that is again a discussion that has to happen with all your stakeholders. So it's very important always that you're not doing this, you should never do this by yourself. You should always do it in consultation, and as wide a consultation as you can manage. So multi-levels of stakeholders, multi-disciplines. And that will help you to avoid the maladaptation trap. Some people might think that big wall, that could be, for some, that could be considered maladaptation. So if we assess the varying levels of climate risk then for the Three Little Pigs, we can say that the brick house has low risk. It had a reasonably high exposure, 3, but a low sensitivity and a high adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity is negative here because it reduces either exposure or sensitivity. In this case, we're reducing the exposure by building the wall. So there you have the brick house has a low risk, the stick house comes out with a medium risk still, and the straw house has a high risk. Now you might say, why does it have a high risk? Because it's behind that wall. We haven't changed the sensitivity, so it's still very sensitive, I suppose, if the wall came down or the wolf got over the wall. But there's also room here, as I said, you're not doing this in isolation, you're doing this with stakeholders. And when the risk assessment calculation is made, you can always adjust it. You could have a discussion. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't feel right. But also I would say don't get too hung up on the numbers. This is quite subjective, but what it helps you to do is have the discussion. And a big part of the value of doing a climate risk assessment is having the discussion, reaching out to stakeholders, finding the information, educating everybody, talking about the issues, talking about the possible solutions, planning for the future. And that all happens during the process. At the end result, what you get is a list of priorities. So we could say that the straw house is the priority because it's still the most sensitive to damage. It doesn't mean that it's going to be damaged necessarily, but this gives you a way of prioritizing your actions, and it should be kept under review. So you can come back or you can put some adaptation, put some monitoring in place, and then reassess your risk after time. So what I'm going to talk to you about now very, very briefly, and I'm going to get to show you some nice pictures, is climate change risk assessment that I was involved with for Skellig Michael, which is the World Heritage Property, one of the 2 World Heritage Properties in Ireland. I'm not going to give you the results because it's not actually published yet, so I'm not in a position to do that. I did a climate vulnerability assessment, as it was called 10 years ago, for Skellig Michael for my PhD. And that is published. And that article link is at the end of the presentation. It's in, I'm trying to remember the name of the journal, but it's at the end of the presentation. I'll show you then. You can also find it on my profile at the university. So I built on that research, but I also, because time had gone by and other people had published on climate vulnerability assessment and climate risk assessment for heritage, also adapted some of their methodologies as well and reapplied it to Skellig. So that was very interesting to go back after 10 years and to reapply it. So I was very fortunate to be able to do that. The process started in 2020. But as we all know, certain things happened in 2020 that kind of meant it all got held up. So it really only finished at the beginning of this year, which is why it hasn't been published yet. But yeah, so I'll just take you through a little bit about Skellig Michael and about what we did. So Skellig Michael is one of Ireland's 2 World Heritage Sites. It is an early monastic monastery, which is located on a very precipitous rock in the Atlantic Ocean about, well, I think it's about 7 kilometers from the coast of Kerry. So it's roughly where the little, if I can get a laser pointer, it's roughly where that little orange spot is there. So it's off the coast of Kerry, and you can see this is what it looks like as you approach it. If anybody's a Star Wars fan, it features in Star Wars. So we were able to do a technical site visit with experts in archaeology, in natural birds and natural heritage, in architecture, stonemasons, policy experts, and so on. And this was interesting for me because when I did the first assessment, I was a lonely PhD student trying to get people interested. And I started that in 2010. Climate change and cultural heritage was not something anybody was really interested in. But now, sort of 10 years later, a lot of people were interested and they're realizing how important it is. So it was great to be in a position where I could be with such a big group of people with such a lot of knowledge about the site and about the heritage values and about engineering approaches. We had a geologist, engineers, yeah, stonemasons, as I said, and so on. So a lot of technical expertise. So that was the site visit. We also did a technical workshop. So we worked through the vulnerability assessment or the risk assessment process, evaluating exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity to various impacts of concern with the technical expertise. And again, very broad group. So multidisciplinary. That's very important that you have different voices at the table. Otherwise, if it's just archaeologists or architects, that will be the focus. And so you need to broaden it out and you need to get a wider understanding. We also had climate scientists present and so on. And we also did a community workshop because it's not just about the technical experts. We wanted to understand how the community perceived climate change risk for Skellig Michael and for themselves, because it, as a World Heritage Site, it has a big economic value for the community. And it also just has it's a very important part of their identity and their sense of place. So we wanted to understand that as well and understand how they evaluated climate change risk. So we tried to be as holistic as we could in terms of evaluating the risks. Just to show you a bit about the site now, for anybody who hasn't been able to be there, and it's quite far away and quite expensive to get there. So I wouldn't be surprised if most of you have never been, but you approach it by boat. The landing pier is, as you can see, quite small, and this is a problem with rising sea level, with rising storm surge. The landing is becoming harder. So getting visitors on and off the island safely is becoming an issue. Getting staff on and off the island safely to do the maintenance is an issue of concern. This is the monastery on the South Peak, or the North Peak, I can't remember actually. This is the main monastery anyway. You can see it's Skellig Michael is characterized by these dry stone beehive huts that the monks lived in the early Christian period. So from about the 8th century till about the 12th century roughly. And that's the mainland over there, so quite far away. And it's built on terraces on the side of this rock, so it's quite vulnerable to erosion and pressure from water drainage. This is just another view of the site. I'll just skip through these here. You can see from further up, you can see the steep topography of the island. You get around the island using these stone steps that the monks originally built and that are maintained by OPW. They're just dry stone slabs, and the slabs come from the island itself because the rock is very close to the surface and it's constantly eroding, which is part of the problem. But you can see again the topography very, very steep, not for people who are afraid of heights. I would not suggest you visit there if you have any concerns about vertigo. But you can see another thing that the island is famous for, which is the bird life. So there's a number of protected species which nest on the island. So it's a combination of natural and cultural heritage which needs to be protected. And many of the birds actually nest within the dry stone structures. So when thinking about climate change risks, we had to consider the natural heritage alongside the cultural heritage, and sometimes there can be a bit of conflict because measures that you might want to take to preserve the wall could actually affect the ability of the birds to breed in them. Just another picture of a puffin because they're so cute. They really are very, very gorgeous. But there's a problem because they when they nest, they burrow, and that, you know, that does lead to some soil erosion. And then when you have a changing climate where you have increased salt spray coming up and killing the vegetation, you have longer dry periods where the vegetation dies, and then you have heavy intense rainfall where the soil and the rocks get washed away. We're getting a lot more erosion, and it's problematic. And it's problematic for the birds too, because they will also lose their habitat. Just another view of the island so you can get some idea of the sheer rock faces and how difficult it is to manage and even to get around this place. There again, you can see that's the nature of the rock, and it's constantly peeling off. And here you can see one of the areas of that was identified. So they did a study on what's the word, like high risk areas for rockfall around the island. And so this is one area where you can see there's a lot of loose stone and soil and not much vegetation. So after heavy rainfall particularly, but at any time really large rocks can come down. And that's a problem for health and safety, obviously, because they could kill somebody. So you can see here the OPW I think in 2022 maybe, they put in these canopies, one here and one here, because these were identified as two areas that were very susceptible or at high risk for rockfall. So they put these canopies in. And I don't know if you can see, but there's a hole in the wall there. It's probably maybe a bit small to see, but basically a big rock came down, bounced off the canopy and hit the wall and broke through the wall. So we're talking about large boulders, not small little rocks. So anybody that had been there, if the canopy wasn't there, they would have been dead. So it's a very big concern for keeping the island open. And it does seem to be getting more frequent. You know, this island obviously has always had erosion and rockfall, but it seems to be becoming more frequent because of the the effects of the climate. So what's being done about it? Well, one concern also is just surface weathering of the stone. So in my PhD, I set up this series of little stone exposure trials around the island. So that's published as well if you want to look it up. It's on my university profile. But that was really looking more at surface weathering of stone rather than rockfall per se. So you can see one of them here, how the lichen has grown on some stones and others are more susceptible to surface erosion. So that's one way, trying to monitor to understand the effects. This is another monitoring device they have on the island monitoring crack movement to see if walls are moving, if there's subsidence. And as I said already, the canopies to address the rockfall was a big investment by the Office of Public Works who managed the island. So as I said, I'm not going to present the results of the most recent climate risk assessment. These are the results from my PhD risk assessment for Skellig Michael, which are published. And it's interesting that in the most recent one, I can say it hasn't changed that much. It pretty much the same risks were coming up, yeah. But what was interesting is that they were more visible, and they were easier to recognize. So it's what we were worried about happening in 2014. We're still worried about, and it is happening. But two things here are that rockfall, which in the initial assessment was a high priority 1, actually in the new assessment has moved down. And that's because of the adaptive measures that were taken on the site. So because of the geological survey identifying areas of high risk, because of the implementation of the canopies to protect those areas and various other management measures, the rockfall actually moved down. So that's the advantage of reassessing, because you can see how your adaptive measures are affecting your risk. Now, that's not to say it's not a risk. It is a risk. It's a serious risk. But some measures have been taken which are at least reducing some of the exposure to that risk. And access, similarly, that has moved down. And that's because there's efforts to create better accommodation on the island for staff members to ensure that they can maybe have longer access. At the moment, they are only able to be on the island during the summer months. So maintenance can only happen during the summer months. So there's a potential for, because of works ongoing, that access is improving. So that also moved down slightly. So that's just to say that, you know, in a way that there was a more complex process happened this time than happened when I did it for my PhD, but the results were kind of similar, so that's good, because we were looking also at exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity. It's just using slightly different approaches. So I would say there's many approaches that you can find in the literature, as long as you're looking at those key parameters. That's the main thing, and involving as many people as you can, and that you should repeat it. So it's not something you just do once and then that's it, because those risks will change over time. The exposure will change, the sensitivity will change, so you need to reassess. So that's the main point from that. I just wanted to flag that as part of my involvement with ICOMOS, I also helped to put together this free toolkit on climate change adaptation. It's a good entry point and lists a lot of useful resources as well. So if you go to the ICOMOS website and look for climate change adaptation toolkit, it should come up. And it has case studies from around the world, just to help you start thinking about what climate change adaptation for heritage might involve. So that's it. You can see there, as promised, there's the article, A Framework for Assessing Vulnerability of Archaeological Sites to Climate Change, which was published in Conservation and Management of Archaeological Sites, and it's open access online. So you should be able to find that. It's also in the university repository. Yeah, so that's it from me. I'm open to questions if there are any.
Hi, thanks for that, Cathy. That was a great talk. We've got one question in the Q&A from Hasna, and they ask, I have a question about the tools for assessments of the structures or stone movements, if it's possible to provide more data about it, and how is that working?
Okay, well, I can tell you what I know, but it's not something that I've been involved with. On Skellig Michael, they have those crack monitors which they attach to either side of the crack, and it's very simple. It pulls apart if the crack moves, and so they monitor that movement. And then they also have more high-tech approach, which is that they do laser scanning over. They repeat I think it's every year. They scan the same area, and over time they've got pins that they survey as well. So they have metal pins which they survey. So they do point surveys of those pins to see if they've moved. They compare the different 3D laser scans to see if they can see any change, and they have the crack monitors. So they've got 3 approaches, and one or all or none may be suitable for you, but you'd have to do a bit of research on what's available, and it does depend on your budget and your technical capacity.
Great, thanks for that. I think that's all the questions we have at the moment, but just in case people are typing, I'll just ask one for myself. You said that there was quite a big difference in sort of change between the first time you went to the site visit and the second in terms of the kind of reception and interest. Is that something you've seen change in every aspect or just in that particular case?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, when I, as you said in your introduction, I got interested in this topic in 2007, which was when the first World Heritage strategy for climate change was published, and because I was studying World Heritage at the time, and it was like nobody, you know, when I was doing my PhD, no climate change, like, I mean, people were very nice, don't get me wrong, everybody helped me out because I was a PhD student, but they didn't see the relevance, and there was no, I mean, I literally read everything published on the topic at the time, you know, it was easy. If you tried to do that now, there's no way you could because it's exploded. The attention on this topic has exploded, as it should, but we're still very far behind the curve. You know, if you think of cultural heritage as the you know, culture and nature being two parts of the heritage coin, then our nature colleagues are way ahead in understanding and responding to climate change impacts. So we've a lot of catching up to do, but there's a huge interest and a lot of work happening out there now. But it has to happen rapidly because the climate is changing rapidly, so it's urgent.
Thanks. We've got a couple more questions. One from Paul who says, thanks, Cathy. Can you discuss in more detail the differences between the methods you've used, i.e. CVI, and any limitations and benefits of the new method?
Okay. That's a detailed question. um, CVI, for those people who don't know it, is the Climate Vulnerability Index that was developed specifically for World Heritage properties. So if you stick rigidly to the CVI methodology, you will only look at World Heritage values. For that reason, it can be a bit limiting. The other thing with CVI is that the good thing about CVI, the thing that I adopted, was the community vulnerability aspect, because in my initial vulnerability framework, which I developed and applied for my PhD, I spoke with a lot of technical experts and stakeholders, and some owners as well, so farmers and things. But I didn't do the community values and the community risk assessment. That the CVI introduced that, and I think that was a really valuable addition. Adapt Northern Heritage is what came out. That toolkit came out of a European Union funded project. You can find that online as well. You can find that information, all that online. That's very detailed, and it gives you different levels at which you can do the assessment, which I think is useful. And it also moves into adaptation planning and response, which is also important because you're doing this risk assessment, but you've got to think about why you're doing it. The whole point is to help to prioritize for decision makers their responses, right? So the Adapt Northern Heritage methodology moved towards adaptation as well, and has a lot of useful information. So I think there's good elements. Everybody kind of built on the previous person, and I suppose when I came back to Skellig, I had learnt from that later work, and I took parts of that as well and made it more systematic, I guess. But I'm sure that somebody could take what we did on Skellig this time and improve again, you know. But I think the main thing is it can be a bit frightening, I think, for people to engage with. So I wouldn't want to say to everybody that you have to do this big bells and whistles, you know, amazing, like the CVI did, you know, like a week-long workshop. That's not maybe possible for everybody. If you can just start having discussions about what your exposure is, what your sensitivity is, what your adaptive capacity is, and understanding what the hazards are, You could maybe use the ABC methodology. That's an ECROM one. It's made for collections, for risk assessment for collections. I mean, risk assessment is something that conservation people do all the time anyway. It's just bringing in that climate specific lens. So sorry, I didn't really answer your question directly, but I would say find the methodology that works for you, given your resources and your capacity. But do make sure that you touch on those key elements of what defines risk and try to be as broad as you can in who you consult.
Great, thanks. And we have one more question as well. What are the quick remedies for identifying archaeological sites due to unexpected heavy rain?
Oh yeah, well, I think this does this refer to like erosion, soil erosion, revealing sites? We get a lot of that in Ireland from coastal erosion, revealing sites. If you can cover it up again quickly, that's great. Documentation is sometimes all you can do. There are citizen science approaches out there because it can be a capacity issue as well. If a lot of stuff is being exposed and you don't have the archaeologists available. So certainly in a lot of coastal areas, there are maybe local people who just go and record sites when they're exposed, because the next storm they can be washed away. You've maybe slightly more control if it's on land rather than on the coast. You've maybe a better ability to recover it and put some protective measures in place. What would be suitable, I don't know, would have to depend on the site itself. But you know, we would generally say use local materials, use compatible materials, because we're talking about climate change, we've also got to think that our adaptation solutions should not be contributing to the problem, because ultimately we want to stop climate change getting worse. So try to use nature-based solutions, try to use low carbon solutions, try not to use concrete or, you know, expensive geotextiles that have to be imported from a country that's 10,000 miles away on a plane. You know, try to just use what's available to you locally, and maybe nature-based solutions, if that will work. I don't know if that was, I mean, in terms of, yeah, I don't know if you wanted more detail on recording and things, but I think the regular archaeological recording methods, things like photogrammetry, drawing, photography, scanning, those are all very important here as well.
Thanks. I think that's all the questions in the Q&A, so I'll just finish off with one. In terms of dealing with your example with the puffins, with dealing with conflicting interests, how do you kind of deal with that and manage that?
Well, luckily I'm not actually in the management of the site. It can cause conflict. It can, because people have different priorities. And it's a negotiated solution in the end. So the management of Skellig Michael involves people who are, it involves conservation architects, it involves specialists in nature conservation, and they discuss together. And the bird life is part of the significance of the island, so everybody recognizes that. And in fact, it was interesting because when we did the climate risk assessment workshops, the most recent one, the impacts on the avian population came out very high, one of the highest. And the reason for that is it's harder to adapt, because if you know, there's not much that the management of Skellig that anybody really can do about fish stocks or, you know, changing you know, availability of food for the breeding birds. If that changes because the ocean currents change, there's not much that can be done. So adaptive capacity is very low, and people are very concerned, and that the birds are part of the sense of place and the intangible heritage of the island, as well as the natural heritage values. So yeah, I think initially there can be a bit of we want to we want to fix that wall and they won't let us, but they work around each other and they work around nesting seasons, and they've actually built up a very good relationship there of years of working side by side. So I think they probably have a lot that they could teach others in terms of collaborative working. And that's the thing with climate change, there's always trade-offs and co-benefits and conflicts, and you have to be aware of that. What happens in one sector, an approach to stopping a flood or stopping erosion or something, can have unintended consequences for somebody else. So it's about broadening that conversation so that you really kind of try and avoid that maladaptation, or at least reduce its effects. But we all have to also maybe learn to compromise a bit.
Thanks. And we've got questions from Sophia, which would probably be a good one to finish off with because we've only got 5 minutes left. So she had a very interesting presentation, and thanks, Cathy. She's a restorer with a master's degree in conservation and restoration of cultural heritage, and she'd like to deepen her knowledge of the relation between cultural poverty and climate change through university courses. Are there any academic classes or any other ways to deepen sort of knowledge on this subject?
That's a very good question. I'm not aware of any masters. Sorry, did you say she was already a master's student, or she's?
Yeah, already masters. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's the sort of thing that would make it, you could do a master's project on, research project. In terms of reading around the topic, there's an increasing amount published on it. There's some really good webinars. Personally, I really like watching videos. So there's the World Monuments Fund have been doing this series on coastal project on coasts. Together with Paul is here. I think it's with Historic England. Maybe he can answer. There's a CIFAL in York in Canada. If you look up CIFAL, they have a series of webinars which are free. I'll try and find the link and put it in the chat later. I think you can access the chat afterwards. Climate Heritage Network published stuff. ICOMOS published stuff. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of one publication to point you to. I mean, Future of Our Pasts. I was involved in writing that with ICOMOS, that was published in 2019. And the idea of that publication was to document all of the potential linkages between climate change and cultural heritage. So you could look at Future of Our Past, but it has to come with a health warning in that we really did shove everything in there. So it's not that easy a read, but the introduction is light, and there's forwards to each chapter and stuff. So you could have a look at Future of Our Past, and maybe that will give you an idea then on areas that you would zone in, because you might be more interested in mitigation or adaptation or climate justice. There's a lot more to this topic as well than just working on sites. So yeah, okay, Future of Our Past, but with the caveat that it's not light reading.
Thanks. I think that's pretty much all we have time for. Again, on the other academic courses, University of Lincoln do obviously an MA, but we also do PhDs in conservation as well if you had a specific topic that you wanted to go on. So I'll put that link down there. And there's also
come and do a PhD.
Yeah, come do a PhD, do it. And then I think UCL, University College London, also have CIHA, which is the Centre for Doctoral Training, and they do quite a lot on heritage science, and I think climate change comes into some of the recent research projects they've done as well. So I'll put the links to those, and you could try those out.
Thanks,
But
Philippa.
otherwise, thank you so much, Cathy, for your time and for doing this presentation. It was really, really interesting, and again, really topical, and will just continue to be more topical as we go forward. And thanks everyone for attending. I think we had a really good turnout from a wide range of countries as well, which is great to get that international side in there as well. If you check on our website as well, we've got some more webinars coming up. I think our next one is in September. They're all based around built heritage. So if you're interested in that, then please check forward. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Philippa. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.